I think we got waylaid by Sigmund Freud, being a physician, and it is not an empirical science. We will never have controlled studies. It is a diminishing activity. I was born and raised in Chicago, Illinois. I went to school in Chicago, grade school, high school. I began junior college here in Chicago, and after a year decided to transfer to the University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana. I got my undergraduate degree in chemistry at the University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana. I was a pre-med, but at that time there were many, many veterans returning from World War II, and I was not a veteran, and so could not get into medical school, which was at that time mainly restricted to returning veterans. So I spent 4 years getting a bachelor's degree in chemistry, and then entered medical school here in Chicago at the University of Illinois, which is situated in Chicago. I attended the medical school at the University of Illinois in Chicago, graduated. I think I graduated the undergraduate school, I think summa cum laude, and the same with medical school. I'm not really sure, but I know I got into all those Phi Beta Kappa and Phi Kappa Phi and AOA, all those scholarly fraternal organizations. And then after graduating from medical school, I began a residency in psychiatry. At that time, the Institute for Psychoanalysis was involved in choosing psychiatric residents, and I was selected after being interviewed at the Institute for Psychoanalysis in Chicago. I began my residency at the Neuropsychiatric Institute at the University of Illinois, spent a year there, and then entered, perhaps forced to enter would be more appropriate, the military, by way of the doctor draft. I was drafted into the United States Army and spent 2 years in the Army, rising to the rank of captain. I served in the military as a division psychiatrist. At that time, all of the Army was divided into divisions, and each division had their own psychiatry. So I worked with the 8th Infantry Division as the division psychiatrist, seeing mainly entering soldiers, seeing if they were fit for the military, and examining them. I was at Fort Carson, Colorado, examining them as to whether they should stay in the military. So I spent around 2 years in the Army, and after leaving the Army, again functioning as an Army psychiatrist, I came back to Chicago and moved my residency to the Psychiatric and Psychosomatic Institute of Michael Reese Hospital, which was at that time being run by Dr. Roy Greenker, who was a wonderful person, who was a good mentor for me. I trained at the Michael Reese Hospital in psychiatry and finished my residency, and at that time almost everyone in psychiatry was involved in psychoanalysis. You couldn't become a chairman of a department without being a psychoanalyst, and most of the training in psychiatry had to do with some form of psychoanalytic thinking. There were some psychiatrists who used organic, at that time what we called organic methods, such as insulin shock therapy or electric shock therapy, but there was no real psychotropic medication. All psychiatry there at that time was fundamentally psychoanalytic in orientation. So concurrent with my residency at Michael Rees, I began psychoanalytic training, finished my residency, went into psychiatric practice, and continued to train as a psychoanalyst. I graduated after 5 years of training at the Chicago Institute for Psychoanalysis, and I was extremely fortunate in that my very first supervisor was Heinz Kohut, who was at that time developing his ideas about the psychology of the self. We formed a little group that worked with Heinz. He would write his papers and distribute them to the group when we would meet and discuss his papers. And then he put together his first book, The Analysis of the Self, and worked with this group, which consisted of myself, Michael Franz Bosch, Ernest Wolf, Paul and Anna Ornstein, David Marcus, Miriam Topin and Paul Topin. And later on we added Morton Stell Shane, and I think somewhat later Bob Stolarow joined the group periodically. He wasn't always a member of the group, since we were Chicago-based and it was mainly Chicago people. But we would meet every now and then, usually here, and we would discuss cases, but mainly Heinz's work. And then when Heinz passed away, his widow and son asked me to finish his last work, How Does Analysis Cure? And along with Paul Stepansky, who did most of the work, and I would say the book is mainly the work of Paul Stepansky's work on Heinz's notes. Paul and I managed to get How Does Analysis Cure published. Along with that work, we had developed meetings of self-psychology. We had annual self-psychological meetings, and we soon began an annual publication called Progress in Self-Psychology. I was the editor, and then over the years we formed an organization. I don't have much to do with the organization any longer, but the organization continues with a great deal of changes, both in personnel and in theory, up until the present time. After Heinz died, we continued to meet, and I then, I think, began to work more independently of the group. Certainly the man who began my interest in psychiatry would be Roy Greenker, who was a wonderful teacher and a scholar and an analyst, who, interestingly enough, was analyzed by Sigmund Freud, and he would tell us stories about that. Greenker, along with Joan Fleming, were the major teachers in Chicago in psychoanalysis. Joan was the dean of the Institute for Psychoanalysis, and a wonderful person, and she too was one of my early supervisors. So I had Heinz and Roy and Joan, although I think everyone called her Joanne at the time, but I called her Dr. Fleming. They were the major forces that contributed to my enthusiasm and interest in psychoanalysis. I was very, very fortunate in having this close relationship to Heinz Kohut. I would say easily, we spoke every night. He would call almost all the time, and I think he became an important part of both of my whole family, really. And his wife and his son and our family were always involved with each other for many, many years. Psychiatry, of course, is completely 100% changed during my life as a psychiatrist, from a psychoanalytically oriented, psychotherapeutically functioning activity to a almost completely non-psychological activity involved with psychotropic medication and brain imaging and what is today championed and trumpeted as the new psychiatry, which is neuroscience, the science involved with the study of the brain and the brain's activity. And so psychiatry is no longer a bed made of psychoanalysis. They become quite estranged, and it's a rare psychiatrist, very rare psychiatrist who's interested in psychoanalysis. The Analytic Institute in Chicago and elsewhere, for a long time, perhaps because of Sigmund Freud, was posited on psychiatrist candidates and psychiatrists' interest in psychoanalysis. These days, it's a very rare psychiatrist who joins and is interested in psychoanalytic training. And so psychiatry has become more and more estranged, if that's the proper word, from psychoanalysis. And today's psychoanalyst is probably not going to be a psychiatrist. And indeed, if one wants to be a psychoanalyst, it probably is no longer wise to go to medical school and become a psychiatrist. Years ago, we looked down on non-medical analysts. Today, there are hardly any medical analysts. They're all non-medical, either from clinical psychology or from psychiatric social work or from a variety of academic activities in the humanities. In fact, the new editor of the Journal of the American Psychoanalytic Association is a linguist who has no training in psychiatry, although she's very accomplished. She didn't go through the rigors of medical school, etc. Now, there was a lot of rationalization as to why one had to be a psychiatrist in order to become a psychoanalyst, including my good friend Bob Michaels insisting that the ethical training that physicians had was necessary to become an analyst, as if non-medical analysts are more prone to non-ethical activities. And of course, the truth of the matter is that most of the research that's been done on boundary crossings shows that the more senior training analysts are usually the ones who commit the boundary violations, whereas the younger analysts are probably more ethically oriented. Psychiatry has become so modified that our best and brightest analytic candidates now come from psychology, social work, or a variety of academic disciplines. We in the American Psychoanalytic Association have what we call a CORST program, C-O-R-S-T, where we encourage academics who have an interest in psychoanalysis to get psychoanalytic training and to combine their academic interests, be it in philosophy, English literature, any varieties of the humanities, and then get analytic training and really enrich psychoanalysis by these non-medical activities. So I think psychiatry is no longer a kissing cousin of psychoanalysis. They're quite estranged, and the future of psychoanalysis must lie outside of psychiatry. Well, see, psychoanalysis is being forced to change. Psychoanalysis has not been at the forefront of understanding where it has to go. It's being forced to change by a paucity of candidates, a lack of patience, and a general diminished enthusiasm for the activity. It would be great if psychoanalysis would act like some of our industrial giants and do the kind of marketing that they need in order to fit their product to the demand. But even today, there's a tremendous amount of energy being wasted in the American Psychoanalytic Association on standards. Now, the truth of the matter is, this is really wasted energy. We have something called the Board of Professional Standards fighting about their status, but it's a lost cause because no one cares anymore. There aren't patients, there aren't candidates. Psychoanalysis is being shunted to the side. There are very, very few people who have a full analytic practice. I think the average analytic caseload for analysts throughout the country is 1 or maybe 2, whereas when I began, everyone had a full caseload of analytic patients. Now it's very unusual for analysts to see many analytic cases and for our candidates to find analytic cases. Also, psychoanalysis seems being forced by the forces of evolution to modify their stand in terms of not only who we train, the kind of patient we see, how much we charge, but what we do. And we see more and more analysts who do a variety of other activities outside of standard psychoanalysis. We see more and more discussions about what is psychoanalysis with, I recently read a wonderful presentation of an analyst talking about seeing a patient for 1 hour and listening psychoanalytically. I have no idea what she had in mind. It was a woman. She had in mind by saying it was psychoanalytic listening. She just didn't say a word. The patient talked for an hour. It was interesting. It was very nice, but it had nothing to do with psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysts don't listen or care or relate any different from anyone else. It's what we understand about our listening, our caring, and our understanding that makes a difference. And we seem to confuse what some analysts call need gratification with what analysts really should be doing, that is understanding and interpreting. It's interesting also to see what's happened to the field of psychoanalysis in terms of publications. For a while there, people wrote books, articles. We had a plethora of journals devoted to psychoanalysis, but that too is drying up. It's very hard to get a book about psychoanalysis published. We don't have many good journals or papers. Some of our journals are mainly devoted to the other add-ons in psychoanalysis, the psychotherapeutic add-ons, need gratification, relationships, all significant and important, but they're not the essence of analysis, which must be interpretive, which must be hermeneutic, because that's really what we do. That's what makes psychoanalysis distinguished from all the other psychotherapies. One of my favorite references is to Maxwell Gittleson, who was a teacher of ours. I think he was the president of the American Psychoanalytic Association, a very, very important figure in Chicago psychoanalysis, who I remember saying over and over again, you don't get analyzed in order to get better. Symptom relief is a byproduct of analysis. You get analyzed in order to understand yourself. And of course, everyone at that point raised their hand and said, but you do get better with psychoanalysis. Why is that? And there's no doubt that understanding something puts you in a different world. You live in a different world. You understand what things mean. When you understand what things mean, one of the very famous philosophers of science in Chicago was Thomas Kuhn, who wrote The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And Kuhn has a very interesting article in which he says that what he calls the human sciences or the social sciences or interpretive sciences, the natural sciences, chemistry, physics, biology, etc. He says are empirical sciences, and he says they're quite different. And what he learned in the structure of scientific revolutions is that when when empirical scientists are working on a particular issue, subject, study, and they start to see it differently, what he called a new paradigm develops. He says that's a new interpretation. What we had been thinking about the stars in the sky, now we see them differently, we live in a different world, our vision is increased, we are truly understanding what they mean differently than we understood before. And Kuhn says that's what the human sciences, and I would say that's what psychoanalysis does. It gives you a new way of looking at things. It gives you, oh, is that what that means? So that when someone is sad and depressed, and you say, well, they're sad and depressed because this particular area of the brain is not functioning and we'll give them an antidepressant, that's a neuroscientific way of looking at it. If you try to understand what the sadness means to them, that's the psychoanalytic way of looking at it. If you try to talk to them about their sadness and they feel better because of the relationship, that's the psychotherapeutic way of looking at it. Those are three different ways of looking at it. And psychoanalysis, there's no doubt, does allow many people to feel better, but it's a different set of activities, an interpretive set of activities, than neuroscience and psychotherapy. I can't remember exactly when I began, but I got interested in Gadamer and his work on hermeneutics. You know, Gadamer was a German philosopher who, interestingly, my own analyst, Fritz Mollenhoff, knew. And Gadamer studied under Heidegger, and Gadamer talked about the science of interpretation, or hermeneutics, and it's very clear that that is what psychoanalysis is, a science of interpretation. So we listen in order to interpret. We relate in order to interpret. We care in order to interpret, but interpretation is what we do. Now, there's no doubt that we have to do many things in order to interpret, but I liken it to if you go to a restaurant and go there for a meal, you may need to use the restroom. The restroom is an add-on. It's not why you go to the restaurant. In fact, I remember once eating in a restaurant and seeing someone come in, use the restroom, and leave, and I thought, what a terrible misapplication of the restroom this is. Well, that's what's happened to much of psychoanalysis. People use psychotherapy as if it were psychoanalysis, but it's an add-on, like the restroom, that is necessary, like the restroom, in order to participate in what the restaurant is all about. So we do relate, we do listen, we do care, we do gratify needs, we do encourage development, but that's in order to understand the patient and make interpretations about the unconscious. The thing that anyone who studies hermeneutics will quickly learn is that there is not one correct interpretation. My good friend Jeffrey Stern and I were once discussing what is the meaning of Othello. And Jeffrey correctly showed, Jeffrey's a Shakespearean scholar, he showed me that there were many ways to understand Othello, and there is not one correct way. Some fit better, some work better, some enlarge your understanding. There are many wrong ways. Othello is not about making risotto, we all know that, but Othello has a variety of meanings to different people. The same with psychoanalysis. There are Kleinian ways, Lacanian ways, Bionian ways, Cohutian ways to understand a patient. But that's what we do. We understand patients. We find out what things mean to patients. We don't relate, we don't listen, we don't care, except in order to understand. And I think there's a very interesting book by David Tuckett, and a study by David Tuckett, where he tries to show how we all might be doing the same thing. And I think it's very important to realize that no, we all are not doing the same thing. Kleinian analyses are different from cohesion analyses, but they're different because we are in a hermeneutic science. If one studies biblical hermeneutics, which, by the way, is where hermeneutics really began its foundation, if one studies biblical hermeneutics, the Catholics have a different interpretation of Leviticus than the Episcopalians and the Jews do. And there are many scholars of the Bible who don't believe in any of it but study it historically. So too, I think we have to understand psychoanalysis. There are many ways to interpret what we see. There are Kleinian ways, there are cohesion ways. There are not correct ways, there are different ways. I wish psychoanalysis would embrace the interpretive science that it is. It is a different science. It is not an empirical science. We will never have controlled studies as much as people yearn and long for them. If we would embrace hermeneutics and interpretation, if we would understand that we were no longer a bedfellow of psychiatry, if we would realize that neuroscience is not what we do, I think there might be a future for psychoanalysis. But the facts are that evolution has shown psychoanalysis that it is a diminishing activity with diminishing interest and diminishing students who want to follow it. So psychoanalysis must adapt to that, or unfortunately, like many mutations in evolution, it may die. Heinz was a very interesting person who managed, he very rarely alienated anyone. In Chicago, there were a lot of people who were very angry at Heinz because he became so famous so quickly and had such a enthusiastic following of students. Heinz managed to get people to either adore him or hate him. Heinz was a truly idealizable person who, as with many very gifted people, one has to tolerate their flaws in order to profit by the relationship. Heinz could be difficult. Being called every night by Heinz could be a bit burdensome. He needed people around him to support him. So he developed this group of us who were quite adoring of him and respectful of him and appreciative of all that he offered us. I think I especially benefit tremendously from knowing Heinz. He was often in our house. He and Betty came and we went to their house. It was a very good, close relationship. But many people were very jealous of it, and many people didn't like it and would love for me, which I couldn't do, to criticize Heinz. Heinz was just a really wonderful, wonderful teacher. I learned a great deal from him. I think people still think that I am some kind of repository of Heinz lore, which unfortunately I'm not, because I can't always remember what he said, when he said it, what he meant, etc. My own interest did deviate a bit from Heinz, although I still appreciate everything he taught me about self-psychology. I think it was almost impossible to be a self-psychologist and not be branded as a self-psychologist and thought of as a self-psychologist in the United States, because it was either you're one of us or you're not one of us. And I hear it's much like that with Lacanian and Kleinian analysts elsewhere. My first analysis was a short-lived analysis because my first analysis, Adrian Vanderveer, a child analyst, had a heart attack and died when I was an analytic candidate. So I don't think I saw him for much more than a year. He died at a young age, and I transferred to the person I felt was always my analyst. Fritz Mollenhoff was a wonderful man who was kind and generous and considerate, and I am convinced very, very therapeutic to me, and I profited a great deal from the relationship with Fritz. Later on, when I was having marital difficulties, I went to see Teresa Benedict, who was a very well-known, famous psychoanalyst in Chicago. To me, she was a bitter disappointment. I don't think I got very much out of analysis with Teresa. She was fine, but I just don't think I gained very much from that analysis. I think I mainly learned about analysis from doing analysis. I often would talk to Heinz Kohut about my patients, and I would often try to emulate Heinz in my practice. Heinz was also very kind, very considerate, very thoughtful man. I think one mainly learns how to do analysis from doing it, and I think it's essential that one has a continual self-analytic activity. I think my own personal analyses mainly started me on the road of self-analysis. It's hardly any patient that I ever see that I don't think about and worry what it means to me in terms of my own life, my own feelings, etc. And many times I think back on patients, if only I'd known this, if only I'd thought of that, if only I'd been this. I recently got a letter from a patient that I had hardly remembered her. She said I saw her many, many years ago, and all she remembered was that I cared. And I thought that was nice that she thinks I cared, but obviously I should have analyzed that, the caring. I think that many of our present-day psychotherapists are using a little of analytic verbiage and analytic concepts, but aren't really doing analysis. During my residency, I developed a very, very close relationship with Michael Bosch, and he and I became very, very close friends. His death was a tremendous loss to all of us. Mike and I taught at Rush together, and we both were in the Kohut group. I think Mike was analyzed by Heinz Kohut, and his loss was very difficult for everyone here. Ernie Wolf was very close, extremely close to Heinz, as were the Tolpins, and in the group we were all close and friendly. I think Heinz felt that I was the most likely to get things done, so that he had me do the book and arrange the meetings and edit his last book, etc. Because, as is common in our practice, people like to talk and don't like to do things. And I remember at our meetings there was always someone who said, well, why don't we? And I always felt that meant, Arnold, would you please? Because this person who would suggest it would never do a thing, but he liked to give directions. And I didn't mind, I didn't mind the work of editing or organizing the conferences, etc. All that, of course, is now beyond me, but it was the kind of things that we did initially. But you need workers when you form groups, and Heinz formed a group around him the same way Sigmund Freud formed a group around him, and he chose people to do various things the way Freud did the same. I'm sure that this is also true of other groups, the Kleinians, the Lacanians, the Bionians, etc. And it's a tragedy in psychoanalysis that these different groups are so antagonistic to each other. Now, the beauty of what David Tucker tried to do was get them to work together, but I think he was under the mistaken impression that they all did the same thing, and they don't do the same thing. In fact, if you read his book, someone says, well, we all believe in the Oedipus complex. That used to be true, it's just not true anymore. We all do interpret the unconscious, but in totally different ways, with totally different results. And I wish we could be at least more tolerant of what we call deviant groups. There was the New York Psychoanalytic Institute, my good friend Sandy Oudejans once told me that they had a course on deviant schools in psychoanalysis. It's like the Center for Cancer. You know, that once you walk in the door, you're already labeled as having that particular disorder. There's nothing deviant about Klein. There's nothing deviant about Lacan. They're different. They see things different. They interpret things differently. Just like the Episcopalians and the Baptists interpret things differently. But I guess a good Lutheran would say the Catholics are deviant. I know the Catholics think the Lutherans are deviant, but that's a tragedy that is inherent in hermeneutics. Well, you know, when you have a family of many children, you never have a favorite child, except they're all your favorite children. I would say the book that I felt was most mine in terms of ownership, that I so delight because these were my ideas, would be Moral Stealth. Because Moral Stealth, a book that I'm so grateful to the University of Chicago for publishing, was, I think, something that I struggled and thought about without too much input from other sources, because I felt this is really what I believe, because I was so taken with the tremendous concerns in our field of doing the right thing, and the concern about boundary crossing, ethical violations, how morality, which we know very little about, had infiltrated into the practice of psychoanalysis. And to this day, I get I read for I'm a reader for the International. I get papers where people assume that we all have the same moral output or interests. There's a new book, a philosophy book about the trolley problem. The trolley problem is a fascinating problem that every philosopher, every moral philosopher knows about. And this book is very interesting. The trolley problem is, if you see a train coming down the tracks and it's going to kill 4 or 5 people, but if you are standing next to a big fat man and you give him a push, he will fall in front of the train and save the lives of these 4 or 5 people. So you have 1 to 5. Do you push the man? And the problem presented to these people in various ways and forms: will you push a button to push the man, or will you push the man? There's a big difference. If you ask the question after a meal, you get different answers from different people. If you ask women rather than men, you get different answers from different people. But the interesting thing is that it presents to us the fact that there are no hard and fast rights and wrongs. And the same idea seems of there are absolute truths, beliefs, rights and wrongs, has so infiltrated psychoanalysis that we seem to think that there are really, really correct ways to do things. There's really a correct way to interpret a dream. There are many ways to interpret a dream. There need not be one correct way. So the whole point of moral stealth was to get us off the bandwagon of we all know these truths to be self-evident. No, we don't. We all look at things differently. Well, I've just written a book, which I hope to get published soon, which is on my latest bandwagon of differentiating the latest infatuation with the brain and neuroscience, with the concern about the mind and meaning, and how the self is involved in these thoughts. I think that Kohut, for one, was a real follower of interpretive science, and he learned about what he was doing because of his absolute commitment and infatuation with empathy. I think he explained empathy. Unfortunately, empathy is so misunderstood by so many people. He explained empathy because he felt it was very important to have a sustained involvement in the life of another person. He would listen carefully in order to try to sit in the shoes of that other person, to see what it must be like to feel that way. And that's how you find out what this situation means to that person. You, in their shoes, you are live in their world, and then you give them a new world to live in. And they say, aha, I see things differently. That's what we do to make people have different meanings. And there's a wonderful quote by John Dewey where he says, meanings cover a much larger area than facts. Facts are truths, facts are empirical science, meanings are much broader, wider, and more encompassing. So that's what psychoanalysts must learn, that they are not involved with absolute truths. There's no moral correctness. There are no truths. I wish I can remember this quote by Gadamer, that we usually come too late to learn the latest truth. I did get interested in perversions, and I wrote a book on perversion. I got interested in the vertical split, and I wrote a book on that. I got interested in boundary violations, and I wrote a book on that. At the time, when I was doing a lot of writing, it was easy to get published. Now it's very difficult to get published. The whole publishing scene has changed, as well as the whole psychoanalytic scene. Well, I was very fortunate to take a course on Heidegger, a wonderful scholar of Heidegger at the University of Chicago, a Hebrew person whose name I can't pronounce. It's in one of my books. A very, very good teacher. I really learned about Heidegger, and I began to read about Heidegger, and I began to try to understand as best I could a very, very difficult philosopher. And then I got interested in, as I've always been somewhat interested in philosopher, but psychoanalysis is not philosophy. It is not applied philosophy. It really is a totally different discipline, and I wish people would recognize that so we could all work together to find out what it is its proper place of residence. So I've always been interested in philosophy because I think we need to recognize that many philosophers have been in interpretive work long before psychoanalysts were. I think we got waylaid by Sigmund Freud, being a physician and his interest in neurology. And I think the history of lay analysis suffered greatly because of this tremendous shotgun wedding between psychiatry and psychoanalysis. It took a lot of people like Erik Erikson to get us away from this involvement with medicine. And I think it'd be unfortunate if, as I've said earlier, that we have a complete break with medicine. We need to be kissing cousins. We need to learn from them and they learn from us without these radical, we have nothing to do with them. The philosopher that I was always most impressed with in the United States whom I did meet once, was Richard Rorty. I went to a meeting with him, and I went for a walk with a number of people, but I was so, how should I say, blinded by his wisdom and delighted being near him that I just remembered walking with him. I don't remember anything he said, but I used to devour everything he wrote. Rorty was a pragmatist. A pragmatist means essentially you do the best you can with what you have. And Rorty became very interested in Heidegger, although Rorty tried to make Heidegger into a pragmatist, which I think that Heidegger was a Nazi more than he was anything else. But yeah, I love Richard Rorty, and I wrote a paper about American pragmatism and American psychoanalysis. And I think I even sent the paper to Rorty. I don't think I ever heard from him in any way, shape, or form, and he's now passed away. But he was just a great, great philosopher who I really respected. Well, I just want to make the plea that we see psychoanalysis as a product of many, many cultural and social forces that are operating in terms of mental health, the treatment of the mentally ill, the proper scientific status of psychoanalysis. And we unfortunately get so involved in issues that will turn out not to matter very much in the long run, because these great forces, driven by the Affordable Care Act, the way we train people, those are going to decide the fate of psychoanalysis, and we should periodically step aside and say, let's look at what's happening to psychoanalysis, and not be so involved in what I consider petty squabbles like over certification and membership, and it's ridiculous I'm sorry to dwell on it, fight about the Board of Professional Standards, which is so ridiculous. It matters not. It matters, that's like saying, should you wear brown or blue when you treat a patient? It's irrelevant. I was talking to my good friend Jack from Australia the other day, and he was telling me that one of his acquaintances said that psychoanalysis was really applied philosophy. And there's just no doubt that people are trying to make sense of where does psychoanalysis belong? Is it one of the humanities? Is it an empirical science? Is it a dinosaur that is on its way to extinction, etc.? And I think we are presently in the grips of making that decision, or having that decision made for us, and whether it will become extinct or whether it will flourish. I doubt it will flourish. It may become extinct. I personally think its hope is in academia, and I think the more the universities get interested in psychoanalysis, the better chance we will have for surviving. So no, I don't think psychoanalysis is applied philosophy. I think we have to find a place for it. It needs a home. And now that it's being thrown out of the Department of Psychiatry, it's got to find a home for itself. Stop fighting about standards. Stop fighting about certification, the ridiculous fights that go on, and start concerning yourself with what is the future of psychoanalysis. my own analysis, again, I would say, started me on the road of self-analysis. I think that's the life we as analysts must pursue.